Hi everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you, so let's begin. I 38M still remember the exact moment when my life imploded. It was a Tuesday evening when I came home from my job at the automotive repair shop where I'd been working as a mechanic for the past 12 years. Nothing about that day suggested it would be any different from the hundreds before it. I pulled into our modest suburban driveway, noticed my wife's brother's expensive SUV parked out front, and thought nothing of it. My brother-in-law visited often, though I never particularly enjoyed his company. When I walked through the front door, I found my wife, 36F, and her brother, 42M, sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of papers between them. The moment I stepped in, they both looked up at me with expressions I can only describe as contempt mixed with something like triumph. "We need to talk," my wife said coldly. Her voice had a hard edge I'd rarely heard before. "What's going on?" I asked, setting down my lunchbox and keys. "What's going on is that I'm done," she replied, sliding the papers toward me. "I'm filing for divorce." I stood there in silence, unable to process what was happening. We'd been married for 13 years. We had 2 children together, our daughter, 10, and son, 7. Sure, we'd had our rough patches lately, mostly related to finances after I'd been cut back to part-time hours for 3 months, but things had stabilized. I was working full-time again. We were catching up on bills. "I don't understand," I managed to say. My wife laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you don't. You never do. You're nothing but a loser. I'm taking the kids and every penny we have." Her brother stood up then, towering over me with a 6 feet 3 inches frame and his designer clothes. He'd always looked down on me, the working-class mechanic who married his sister. He'd made his money in real estate development and never let anyone forget it. "She deserves better than you," he sneered. "Always has. You've been holding her back for years." I learned that my wife had emptied our personal checking account that morning. All $8,700 we had saved. Money that was meant for our mortgage payment, the kids' after-school activities, and the remaining balance on our family vacation planned for summer. She'd also taken the $2,000 emergency cash we kept in the home safe. As I stood there trying to make sense of it all, my brother-in-law walked past me, deliberately bumping my shoulder. I followed him outside, still in shock, and watched as he pulled out his car keys and dragged them along the side of my 12-year-old Toyota, my reliable work vehicle that was finally paid off last year. "Pathetic," he said, getting into his SUV. "Just like you." My wife had already packed bags for herself and the kids. She told me they were staying at her brother's place until I figured out how to move out. According to her, I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live because she wanted the house. She claimed she'd been talking to an attorney who assured her she could get everything. That night, I sat alone in our house, surrounded by family photos and the ghosts of what I thought was a decent marriage. I called my sister, who lived about an hour away. She immediately offered her spare bedroom, but I wasn't ready to leave my home just yet. I needed to understand what had happened and what my options were. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and made an appointment with a divorce attorney. I couldn't afford much, but I scraped together $300 for an initial consultation using my credit card. The attorney, a straightforward woman in her 50s, listened to my story without judgment. "So your wife emptied the joint account without warning and is now staying with her brother with your children?" she asked, taking notes. "Yes," I confirmed, and she's saying her attorney told her she can get everything: the house, full custody, my retirement. The attorney raised an eyebrow. "Did she mention the name of this attorney?" I shook my head. "I'd like you to do something," she said. "Document everything. When she took the money, when she left with the kids, any communication you've had. Don't delete any texts or emails, and give me bank statements showing the withdrawal." I did as she suggested, pulling up our online banking. That's when I noticed something strange. The money had been transferred, not to my wife's personal account, but to her brother's business account. I showed this to my attorney. She leaned forward with sudden interest. "That's unusual. If your wife and her brother are mixing personal and business finances like this, especially during a potential divorce proceeding, do you have access to any other accounts or financial records you share with your wife?" I did. While my wife had emptied our main checking account, she hadn't touched our online savings account that was linked to it, but required separate login credentials. I rarely accessed it since we were saving that money for the kids' college funds. When I logged in, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, there had been multiple transfers from our savings to her brother's business account, totaling nearly $26,000. Money that was meant for our children's future. The attorney's expression turned serious. Do you know what your brother-in-law's business is exactly? Real estate development, I said. He buys properties, renovates them, sells them for profit. At least that's what he's always bragging about. I'm going to need you to print all of these statements, she said, and I'm going to recommend a forensic accountant I work with. It turned out that my brother-in-law's successful business had been struggling for over a year. He had over-leveraged himself on a development project that had gone south when the zoning commission rejected his permit applications. Based on the timing of the transfers, it appeared that my wife had been secretly funneling our family's money into her brother's failing business venture. The attorney explained that this changed everything. This isn't just about divorce anymore. This is potentially fraud, especially if these transfers were made without your knowledge or consent. I was given clear instructions. Don't confront my wife yet. Continue documenting everything, and follow up with the forensic accountant. I also needed to open a new bank account at a different bank immediately for my upcoming paychecks. That evening, my wife texted me demanding that I sign some preliminary separation papers her attorney had drafted. She wanted me to come to her brother's house the next day to sign them and arrange when I'd be moving out. I replied simply that I'd be consulting with my own attorney first. Her response was immediate and hostile. Don't waste money on an attorney. You can't afford one anyway. Just sign the papers and make this easy on everyone. The next day, exactly 48 hours after my wife's declaration and her brother's car keying incident, I received another text from my wife. We need to talk. Come to my brother's house at 7 p.m. Bring the separation papers. I consulted with my attorney, who advised me not to go alone and to record the conversation if it was legal in our state. It was with one-party consent. She also told me not to sign anything. When I arrived at my brother-in-law's sprawling house in the expensive part of town, I brought my sister with me as a witness. My wife answered the door, clearly surprised to see I wasn't alone. What is she doing here? She demanded. She's here as a witness. I said calmly. I thought it would be good to have someone neutral present. My wife reluctantly let us in. In the living room, my brother-in-law sat in an armchair like he was holding court. My children were nowhere to be seen. Where are the kids? I asked. At a friend's house. My wife responded dismissively. This isn't a social visit. The conversation started civil enough, with my wife explaining that she wanted a clean break and that her attorney had advised her on what she was entitled to. But when I asked for the name of this attorney, both she and her brother became evasive. That's not important right now. My brother-in-law interrupted. What's important is that you signed these papers and agreed to move out by the end of the week. I took the papers but didn't sign them. Instead, I placed them on the coffee table and said, I've been doing some research of my own. I've discovered some interesting transactions from our savings account. The color drained from my wife's face. Her brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. I'm talking about the $26,000 you transferred to your brother's business account over the past 6 months. I replied evenly. Money from our children's college fund. My brother-in-law stood up abruptly. You should leave now. I intend to, I said, but first I want to know why my wife emptied our accounts and gave our savings to you. It's a loan, my wife snapped, for a business investment. It's going to pay off. A loan I never agreed to, I pointed out, for a business that, from what I understand, is failing. That hit a nerve. My brother-in-law took a step toward me, his face flushed with anger. My business is none of your concern. It became my concern when you took my children's college money, I replied. My attorney thinks the court will be very interested in these transfers, as might the IRS, considering there's no loan documentation and no reported interest. The mention of the IRS caused a visible reaction from both of them. My brother-in-law's real estate ventures, it seemed, already had some tax complications he'd been trying to resolve. "You're bluffing," my wife said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I pulled out copies of the bank statements my attorney had advised me to bring. No bluff, just facts. What followed was a chaotic 30 minutes of accusations, denials, and finally, a breakdown of the truth. My brother-in-law's business was indeed failing. He had convinced my wife to invest in his latest project, promising substantial returns that would never materialize. She had been secretly transferring money for months, believing she was securing our financial future. When his business continued to struggle, the plan evolved. She would divorce me, claim as much as possible in the settlement, and use that money to help save her brother's business and reputation. "You had no right to investigate my business," my brother-in-law said through gritted teeth. "And you had no right to my money," I replied, "or to key my car, for that matter." My sister, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I've recorded this entire conversation," she said, holding up her phone, "just so we're all clear on what's been admitted here." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. My wife looked horrified, while her brother looked like he might explode with rage. "That's illegal," he shouted. "Actually, it's not," I said. "This is a one-party consent state, and my attorney advised me to document everything." I stood up, collected the bank statements, and headed for the door with my sister. Before leaving, I turned back to my wife. "I want to see my children tomorrow," I said, "and I expect the money you took from our checking account to be returned by noon, all of it. Otherwise, my attorney will be filing emergency motions with the court first thing Monday morning." My wife, now pale and subdued, nodded silently. The next day, the money was back in our joint account. I immediately transferred it to my new account, as my attorney had advised. My wife brought the children home, saying she needed time to think. I spent the day with my kids, careful not to mention the situation with their mother, just focusing on being present with them. By Monday, my attorney had filed for divorce on my grounds, citing financial misconduct. She also filed motions for temporary orders regarding the marital home, custody arrangements, and financial disclosures. The documentation of the unauthorized transfers, combined with the recorded admission, provided strong leverage. The court ordered a full financial investigation, froze any further transfers to my brother-in-law's business, and granted me temporary custody of our children while my wife found new accommodation. She couldn't stay with her brother due to potential witness tampering concerns. It was later revealed to the forensic accountant that my brother-in-law had not only convinced my wife to transfer our savings, but had been planning to use the marital home as collateral for a business loan once my wife secured it in the divorce. His business was much worse off than anyone realized, with multiple creditors closing in. He had essentially been using my wife and our marriage as a financial lifeline. My wife, faced with the evidence of her brother's manipulation and her own poor judgment, eventually agreed to a settlement that was fair to both of us and prioritized the children's interests. She admitted that her brother had convinced her that I was financially irresponsible and that taking control of our assets was the only way to secure her and the children's future. She believed his promises that his business would turn around and make her investment worthwhile. As for my brother-in-law, the IRS did indeed become very interested in his business practices following the divorce proceedings. Last I heard, he was facing charges for tax evasion and fraud related to other investments he had solicited. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. We share custody of our children, with me having primary physical custody. I kept the house, ensuring stability for the kids. My wife, now living in an apartment across town, is working to rebuild her relationship with them and with reality. She's admitted to being blinded by her brother's influence and the allure of his seemingly successful lifestyle. Sometimes I still can't believe how quickly my life changed, how my wife of 13 years could turn on me so completely, convinced by her brother that I was the problem when he was the one draining our resources all along. But in those 48 hours between her cruel words and the moment they realized their mistake, I learned something valuable about standing up for myself and for what's right. My car still bears the scratch from my brother-in-law's key. I could afford to fix it now, but I've left it there as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response isn't an immediate reaction, but a strategic one, and that even an ordinary mechanic can outsmart those who underestimate him. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.